This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Josh Simmons. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode I have the pleasure of talking with Josh Simmons. The second volume in his Jessica Farm project came out just recently from Fantagraphics, but before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off at the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that go higher from there. And in fact, you can find several of Josh Simmons' books at great discounts on Discount Comic Book Service. Both volumes of Jessica Farm you can get for 35% off of the cover price. You can also find his book that came out last year, Black River, at 35% off cover. And you can find his rather interesting collection of comics, The Furry Trap, at, you guessed it, 35% off of the cover price. So whether you're looking for Josh Simmons comics or just any comics whatsoever, you would do well to check out Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. I've been a fan of the work of Josh Simmons for a while. I think I was first introduced to his comics in the anthology Mome that used to come out from Fantagraphics. He had several things there. I was also a fan of his 2007 book, House, and the first volume of Jessica Farm that came out not too long after that. And if you're a listener of the podcast, you should recall that almost exactly a year ago, Gene and I discussed Josh's book, Black River, and both of us really liked it. So this spring, when the second volume of Jessica Farm came out, I had to have him on the podcast for an interview. We have a great conversation talking about the making of Jessica Farm, but we talk about a lot of his other comics as well. And I want to let you listen to that conversation right now. I'm pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Josh Simmons. His second volume of Jessica Farm was recently released from Fantagraphics. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Derek. Thanks for having me.
You know, I said that the second volume of Jessica Farm just recently came out, but also there was a brand new edition of that first volume, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
yes.
It had been a while since the original release, which was, 2008?
Mm-hmm. 2008 came out, yeah.
So why the decision to put out once again, or in a new edition, Jessica Farm 1 along with Jessica Farm 2?
A couple reasons. One is I kind of felt like I blew the design on that first volume, and because I designed it myself, and I don't think it looked great. So I like the idea of having like a newer, fresher version of it. And also when we were talking about doing the second volume, the idea of having them work together in their design elements was something we wanted to do. As well as, since there's a volume coming out every 8 years, I like the idea of completely redesigning it every 8 years to kind of fit with whatever's happening in book design in the particular decade that each volume is coming out. So I'm kind of hoping in 2024 to re-release and redesign the first and second volumes as well to work with
Oh, really?
the third volume. Yeah, yeah, and maybe have a completely different designer on each round of books, and who knows? Like 2024 is a few years away, so that's part of the fun of this project. Is like I have certain ideas about what to do or what we're going to do with it, but it ends up going, who knows where it's going to go.
Huh. Do you think that any of your dedicated fans will regret the fact that every 8 years there is a redesign and a new edition of the previous books?
I mean, I guess it's possible. But to me, I put all the different versions of ways in which this story has been published over the years. I put them all together and took a photograph of them, which I'm going to post. I'll send you one maybe. The idea, since there's such a long amount of time in between volumes, I feel like, and it's kind of such a unique project. I think the idea of like having all the different weird versions of how it's come out over the years together, I don't know, might be interesting to a collector type, which I'm not generally interested in with comics, like the kind of collector side of things. But yeah, I guess hopefully people aren't too disappointed.
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, those who are very much into your work, I would think, would appreciate the way that your comics kind of come out. In other words, if they're process junkies, they would be interested to know the differences of your design, right, depending on what year you put them out and what changes you make.
That's a better way to say it, is maybe like the process oriented. Hopefully, in that way, it's interesting to anyone who might be following this comic.
Okay. So the larger Jessica Farm story, and I want to make sure I'm correct here. Basically, what you're doing, and you started this in January of 2000, where you will create 1 page a month, and then the first volume included the 1 page a month from January 2000 to December 2007, and then this most recent volume from January 2008 to December of last year.
Right. And that's, so, I mean, when I started the comic, the idea was simply that, like, I wanted to create this fantasy comic, which I drew over 50 years, because I don't know if I'd ever quite heard of something like that. And so I never had any kind of publication plans, starting off, except maybe that there would be a final 600-page book in 2050. But so along the way, I think first in 2004, I did a mini comic version of the first, 3 or 4 years. And then in 2007, I'd put out House with Fantagraphics. And I think it was after that came out that I got the idea of asking Fantagraphics if they would do a volume every 8 years, which is 96 months, 96 pages, which is enough for a book, for a graphic novel. And fortunately, they're bonkers enough that they went along with it.
And you mentioned House, and then last year we had Black River. So it's not as if Jessica Farm is the only thing you're doing, right? So if people love your work, for instance, let's say they pick up the first 2 volumes of Jessica Farm that just recently came out, and they're bowled over, and they go, well, damn, the guy doesn't come out with another book for another 8 years. They can still count on you doing other projects, both shorter and longer form, along the way.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I don't want people to, I think, Jessica Farm isn't even the best representation of my work because of the nature of the project and the process of it. It's incomplete, and it's going to be incomplete until 2050. And it's also something that I don't put 100% of my, skills and efforts into with every individual page, because I set up this schedule where I have to do a page a month, but sometimes I don't have that much time in a month. So some of these pages are a little rushed or a little dashed off. The art is definitely looser than a lot of my other stuff. So, um, yeah, I think of my other projects, like the Furry Trap is probably like the best short stories I've done up to the point of that book coming out, and House and Black River are what I think of as two graphic novellas, which are probably like a better representation of my stuff, but the long-term hope and goal is that in 2050, when this book comes out, that it's that it's all worth doing, and it'll be worth seeing in a final package.
Yeah. Now, you just referred to the Furry Trap. Now, the Furry Trap is, and this came out from Fantagraphics in 2012, and it's a collection of your shorter work, most of which had been previously published in a variety of different anthologies, right?
Yep. It had been in Sleazy Slice and Mome and Kramer's Ergot. And I think mini comics that I'd made of some of the strips and other places as well.
Yeah. But there were a few in there, weren't there, that had not been previously published, at least in book form?
Yeah, I think the last two stories I made just for the book.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to say that last story, Demonwood, has to be, I was going to say the creepiest of the collection. I would venture to say one of the creepiest, period, short comics that I've read. In a long, long time. I mean, it's like slow-paced horror.
Yeah.
It's the insinuation, and with the little baby demon toward the end, explaining what the protagonist has got himself into and what he has in store. I mean, that I just thought that was really horrifically brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that story is a good bridge to some of the work I started doing afterwards, where the Furry Trap is very explicit throughout most of the book, most of the stories, and I wanted to do a story that didn't actually show any violence or sexual content, but still, I guess I pulled it off because people say that story is maybe the scariest story in there. And since then, a lot of the stories I've done are very, very subdued, and Black River is to some degree, I guess. I guess it's pretty explicit, but yeah, restraint in my old age, a little bit of restraint. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
In fact, I was going to ask you about this, and you're putting it in terms of restraint. One of the things I've noticed in going back and looking at your body of work that I'm familiar with as a whole in preparing for this interview is I was noticing that with the shorter comics, they're much more explicit in terms of the sex, the violence, and the language. Not that the explicitness is not there in Jessica Farm, Black River, and House. It's a little more muted or restrained, as you put it. And I'm wondering if that was a matter, or I guess a function of, you said, getting older and more mature, or if it's just a different kind of writing. So, for instance, when it comes to shorter comics, you're much more apt to just let things go and go over the top, or just let your id run free. Whereas with the longer works like Black River, House, and Jessica Farm, you're kind of pacing yourself because you're in it for a longer haul.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. But I mean, Black River and Jessica Farm definitely have their over the top moments. But I noticed that too. Like the Furry Trap, the short stories tend to be a lot more over the top and even a little funnier, I think, sometimes a little more humor oriented. And I noticed that House and Black River, for some reason, yeah, maybe it's somehow I'm tightening up when I'm writing them, but they tend to have less humor, and they're just a little more, they're just not as funny necessarily. I'm not sure why that is exactly. But yeah, maybe I'm just taking them a little more seriously, or yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Black River and House, I mean, both of those, there's not much, if any, humor to it, and they're very dark stories, and especially the way that they end. Now, there's humor in Jessica Farm, but one of the things I see among the larger stories that you're telling, Jessica Farm, Black River, and House, is that all three are journey narratives in some form or another. So, like with Black River, it is this post-apocalyptic world where we don't know what happened. We got a group of people, some die off, some become a part of the group later on, and they're on their way to something, but it's ill-defined. With House, you have the three kids getting lost in this gigantic mansion in search or on a journey for something, and then something happens to them eventually toward the end. And then Jessica Farm, there's definitely a quest narrative going on there.
Right. I mean, I guess that's a classic storytelling technique, right? Like the adventure narrative, quest, travel narrative. Do you think the short stories are more static?
Not. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that they may be more situationally based. Although in the Furry Trap, oh God, what is that one story? The longest story is Cockbone. I mean, and that's a journey story. I mean, literally, you have this a strange family that ends up going, or at least two members of this family go on a journey, and at least in the last half of this. So, yeah, I wouldn't say the other stories are static, or your shorter comics are more static. It's just they're, again, more situationally based, and that's probably a function of the humor.
Right. Well, I think one thing I could say is that what can make a good comic can be like really simple things. And for me, when I was a teenager and I first started getting into, say, Chester Brown or any number of good cartoonists or comics, like it can be as simple as seeing a figure move through a space. If you see if it's convincingly portrayed, just that alone can be compelling. And the other basic thing I realized a few years ago is that, like, just having two characters interacting, that alone can be interesting. Because previous to House, I'd done a fair amount of comics that were kind of like rant comics, if you know what I mean, like kind of stuff in the 90s where you're just like telling the reader how it is, man. Just like a Harvey Pekar strip where you're just talking at the reader. And so I realized at a certain point that just having two people interacting, it can be as simple as that. So maybe that's part of the travel adventure narrative thing.
Yeah. You mentioned the rant comic. I see this most clearly in that second issue of Happy, the series that you had from Top Shelf, in that to say that you're making fun of autobiographical comics would be putting it lightly. It's like you're trying to rip them a new one.
Yeah, you can burn that comic, by the way. I wouldn't mind.
Oh, you don't like it now?
Yeah, that's... Oh, no. I mean, yeah, God, that's like 15 years old at this point. But that's definitely one of the comics that I regret doing the most. Because it is like this smarmy, shit-headed, know-it-all kind of perspective that I was trying to take. And, and it's because there's plenty of autobiographical comics that I love, and I would probably rather read most days a good autobiographical comic than necessarily like an adventure narrative or something. So, but I don't know. Just to give the younger me a little credit, there is still some of that which is, which can be pretty rough to get through.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned a moment ago Chester Brown, and it's funny because with some of your stories, and I think that Jessica Farm is a good example of that, the way that you tell the story reminds me a lot of what he used to do with Yummy Fur. I guess the best example of that would be what eventually became Ed the Happy Clown, where many times the story, the events that take place one after the other, seem to be almost disconnected at times. It's almost as if with every event or scenario, Chester Brown was having fun just doing whatever the hell he wanted to, and then he would link that to the next thing, which maybe was tenuously connected to what came previously. But it made it fun, and there was this sense of kind of abandon in a sense of storytelling, really, really loose. In other words, that it's serious to a point, but at the same time, and the reader knows, yeah, we're going to have fun on this adventure.
Yeah, so with the new volume coming out, like it gets me thinking back to like what the hell was I thinking? Where did this comic come from? And probably some of the biggest influences were, so it started in 2000. So I had gotten into weirdo comics in the 90s, and one of the big ones was Ed the Happy Clown. Another one was Like a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron by Dan Clowes.
Oh yeah.
And both of those, I'd read about the process of how they were made, and they were both kind of spontaneous narratives where they kind of sat down, they didn't know where it was going, and they made it up as it went. And it definitely gives the narrative this kind of energy, which is hard to pin down, which you don't necessarily get with something that's more structured. So this was kind of my attempt at that. I think I figured out about maybe around the time the first volume came out that it's not necessarily a strength of mine. Like, some cartoonists are very good at that way of working, but by the time the first volume came out, I had started doing these more heavily structured things like Cockbone, I think, around that time. And I think I'm better as a cartoonist the more I plan something. So I don't think probably Jessica Farm hits the heights of comics like some of the better ones in that kind of way of working. But part of the thing about it is that I can adapt as I go with this comic. So with the second volume, I planned it a bit more so that it had a little bit of a more satisfactory ending. I wanted it to end on kind of a happy note. And I have a lot of things in mind for the future for this comic. I have a structure in place to some degree that's also elastic that I can play with. I'll say like the third volume in 2024, I'm planning on wrapping up this first arc or chapter of the story. So it'll kind of function as an almost 300-page graphic novel in itself. And there's a few reasons for that. I want it to just be a somewhat satisfactory, self-contained read. Like, say, if I do die before 2050, and just to take so long with something, just to make a comic that actually, functions on its own as a somewhat of a complete idea. Yeah.
So it's conceivable that when you're finished with Volume 3, in another 8 years, I guess not quite 8 years, then you could, instead of coming out with new editions of Volumes 1 and 2 and then 3, you could just have one volume of this first 300-page arc.
Yeah, I've been thinking exactly that the last few days. That might be a little better for a bunch of reasons. And yeah, we'll see. It's a few years off, but that might be the way to do it at that point. Yeah, and then I have like a framework in mind for what's going to happen beyond that, which I'm really, really excited about, and it's gonna fit into it's going to work with the process of how this comic is being made. So obviously, in some way, it's about time passing, and I'll just say like Jessica's going to age. That would seem to be the obvious thing to do, and that's going to be part of it.
You say you get excited in some of the things you have coming up. Do you ever get to the point that you want to do more than one page a month, and is it difficult to restrain yourself to only do one page a month?
It's not, because I have so many other projects going on. I tend to be working on like 4 or 5 different things at a time. So if anything, it's more of a strain to work on this because so many other projects are like demanding my time.
Okay, well, so far we've been talking about Jessica Farm in kind of a broader sense, right? We've talked about the design, your plans for the storytelling, and all that, but we haven't really talked about the story proper. So for people, when they say, "Hey, I'm interested in Jessica Farm," what's it about? What do you tell people?
That's a good question because I've been to a couple of conventions this spring and have been talking to people about it, and I realized I always describe the process of making this comic before I actually describe what it's about, and maybe that's not a great way to go about it. Because, I mean, in a way, I think of that as the selling point of it, but yeah, I mean, it's. I think of it as. I think I had read Alice in Wonderland and Lord of the Rings in the couple years previous to starting this comic, so I was thinking of like a big fantasy adventure classic kind of narrative, and basically, it's about a teenage girl who wakes up in her bedroom on Christmas morning, and she lives in a farmhouse on a farm, and she's just trying to get downstairs to open her presents. And along the way, she just keeps getting sidetracked and sidetracked and sidetracked by there's all kinds of different creatures that live in her house and live on the farm. And it kind of culminates in there's a giant monster battle in the second volume that happens outside in the backyard. And the house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, which, yeah, so it's like, it is a fantasy setting. And yeah, she's just trying to get downstairs to open her presents.
Yeah, the house that she's in, and even when she goes to the barn, or to the Smith barn in the, I guess, the end of the first volume and then into the second, it's like, it is this kind of Doctor Who effect. It's bigger on the inside than on the outside, which reminds me of the experience of reading House.
What do you mean that's a Doctor? What is that ref? I've never seen Doctor Who.
Oh, okay. Oh, Doctor Who travels around in a TARDIS. It's something called a TARDIS, which on the outside looks like an English police booth, right? Where there's a phone in. And anytime someone goes inside of the TARDIS, they look around and they're amazed at, this is like a giant ship on the inside. And Doctor Who always says, yes, I know it's bigger on the inside than on the outside.
Oh, cool. Okay. Huh. Yeah, I didn't. I mean, the other story where I've seen a similar idea is a book called House of Leaves. Have you read that?
Oh,
I think it came out around 2000.
I remember hearing about it, but I have not read it. But that does sound familiar.
It's sort of similar. It's like kind of a haunted house, and you go inside and there's like doors that are impossible, that can't be there, that go into a hallway, which should be going outside. And there's like a labyrinth basically, and completely. And yeah, so it's kind of a similar, and I can't remember if I had read that book before. I think I read it after I'd started Jessica Farm. So, but whatever.
Yeah. And in the house, the interior or the interiors in Jessica Farm are dreamer, at times even nightmare-like.
Yeah. They're, I mean, I wanted the story to have more friendly and benevolent creatures, as well as more malevolent creatures, so that it's a mix. Like there's friendly forces, and there's forces that are after her.
Yeah. And, I really enjoy the names that you've chosen for some of these creatures, both the good ones and the bad ones. I mean, in Jessica Farm, the first book, we're introduced to Monkey, Monsieur Blouseau, and Captain. And then, of course, one of my favorite names, Mr. Sugarcock.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. That character is based on my friend Greg, who, if you have any of the old Happies, you might have seen some of my circus comics.
Oh, yeah.
And he's my friend who I've drawn probably more than anyone else, so I modeled the character after him, and then I asked him what I should call him, and he came up with that name. So, yeah, that's where he came from.
And which character in Circus?
Oh, his circus name was Flag.
Okay.
And he's the one who would perform autofellatio while lying on a bed of nails.
Okay. I'll have to go back and look at that issue of Happy.
Yeah.
So, but as fun as that name is, Mr. Sugarcock, I think the names you come up with, the more malevolent forces are even better. I mean, outside of the fact that her father or daddy is this big, literally a shadowy figure, there is Samson Shitneck, Krangle Shitters, and Scrats.
Yeah, there's something with the SK. I think that a Danish thing, maybe. It's it might have something to do with I lived in Sweden for a year, and so I actually, like, the year before I started this comic, so I think I was absorbing like Scandinavian culture to some degree. I think that might have carried over a little bit into the comic.
So, I mean, where do you come up with these characters in Jessica Farm? Both the really destructive, violent ones, as well as the good people like Monsieur Blouseau. Because they do strike me again as dream or nightmare like. Are these figures that maybe you have created in your dreams?
Let me grab the books. 1 second. Yeah, in my dreams, I don't know. I mean, a lot of my stories come from my dreams. A lot of the horror stories, I'll use my dreams as a starting point, and then kind of write from there. But Jessica Farm, I don't know if it's just, how do you describe that? I mean, it's just like I sit down and look at the previous month's page, and then I just sort of daydream what's going to happen next. But I'm sure there's things in here that I must have dreamt before. I don't know. It's more like it's just ideas. Some of the ideas I've had just months or years ahead of time, like the end of volume 2. Something happens, which I guess I don't want to give that away, but it was sort of like kind of the happiest thing I could think of and happiest note for it to end on. Mm-hmm. And I'd been thinking about it for years. Yeah, I don't know. So daydreams, maybe that's the answer.
Yeah. Well, do you keep a dream diary?
Yeah, not a dream diary necessarily. I would like to be more disciplined about it, because I know the more you write them down, the more you remember them, and the more you can potentially lucid dream. But I do write down the better ones that I have in my sketchbooks. Do you have a dream diary?
I used to keep dream diaries, and this happened when I was in undergraduate school. I was an English and psychology major, and I was fascinated by a lot of my psychology classes, especially that dealt with the unconscious or the subconscious. And I had a professor in one of those courses, I think it was a course on personality theory, who mentioned something about a dream diary. And so I asked him about it after class, and he suggested, yeah, why don't you keep it? You can probably remember your dreams better. And he was right. And as you point out, the more you write down, the more you begin to remember. And I only kept it for about, I don't know, off and on, maybe about 5 years. And I enjoyed doing that, but it had gotten to the point that I was remembering so much of my dream that it would take a good part of my morning to get everything down. So instead of just waking up and, right, going to the bathroom, having breakfast, and running off to class, I would spend at least 30 minutes writing down the details of my dreams.
Yeah, that's what happens, right? I know whenever I wake up and I have an interesting dream or nightmare, I'm like, okay, I guess I should write that down. It seemed pretty simple. Like, the basic details are pretty simple. But I always find when I sit down and start writing, like, it always ends up taking way longer than I think it's going to. And I also start remembering things as I start writing, Did you ever get to the point of lucid dreaming?
Of what now? Lucid dreaming?
Lucid dreaming, yeah.
And that is what? Where you're aware of the fact that you're dreaming and then you think in those terms?
Yeah, I think basically, like, I guess the idea is you become fully conscious that you're in the dream and you can move through it. It's not like you're an automaton or you're being put your control. It's like you're in fully control and you can, like, go and open a door if you want to, or go outside or whatever.
Within the dream.
Yeah.
I've had dreams like that, but I don't remember that being a function of me keeping a dream diary. In other words, exercising my memory in your dream memory when you keep a dream diary. I don't remember that making me more aware and having those kind of dreams. But I'll have to go. I haven't looked at my dream diaries in years. Who knows? Maybe I did have those, and I'm just forgetting. Do you experience that a lot?
I don't know. I think I may have a few times over the years, but I don't experience it a lot. Okay. Yeah, there's been times. You know what? Okay, so this was a dream I had I believe it was 1999. This is when I was living in Sweden. And the dream was like it was in some kind of cavernous space, and there was some kind of strange meeting going on. And I remember I became fully conscious in the dream, and I was like, okay, I'm awake in this dream. I know I'm dreaming, and this was also probably influenced by watching Nightmare on Elm Street obsessively over and over as a kid, where they're like carrying things over from the dream world to reality. So in the dream, I thought, I'm going to grab something and I'm going to bring it into the waking world. And I grabbed a draw. I think in the dream I'd made these drawings, and it was like of a devil character holding a cracked mirror. So I grabbed this piece of paper with this drawing, and I was like, okay, I'm going to wake up and take this into the real world. And I remember just this feeling of like being in a washing machine, or just very, very like intense, or like being in a whirlwind, as I was coming into the waking world and trying to hold on to this piece of paper and bring it out into reality. And when I woke up, I of course did not have the piece of paper, and I was very heartbroken by that.
Yeah, this is all sounding like Inception territory.
Sure.
Yeah. So, well, just talking about your comics and the dreamlike quality to them, Jessica Farm and others. I mean, I'm thinking now of that story that was collected in the Furry Trap, The Night of the Gibblers, which is it's a horrific comic, just like Demon Woods is. Maybe not as bad, or not as scary, but there is something very nightmarish about that, and there are occasions where, if I remember correctly, the protagonist falls asleep a few times, and it's almost as if, I remember the first time reading it thinking, is this actually going on, or is this part of his dream world?
Right, yeah, he's having a dream within the story, which happens, you go in and out of the dream throughout the story.
Oh, that's right, okay.
Yeah.
But the Gibblers themselves are not the dream.
No, they're real within the story. But I think kind of the idea, I don't know if I communicated that as clearly as I could have, because I think sometimes people were a little confused by it. But so that main character is having this dream, which he keeps going back, and it's the same narrative within that dream every time it picks off in the place where it left off. And kind of the idea is like his dream intersects with what's happening in the real world. So, yeah, what happens to him at the end of the story kind of leads into what's happening in the dream.
So you mentioned earlier that you've done a number, at least early in your career, the mini comics, and then you had from 2001 to 2004 that series through Top Shelf Happy. Do you prefer now to work in a longer form, and if so, do you think something's lost or something's different, either good or bad, by not working in a shorter form like mini comics or serials?
No, I like both probably just as well. I definitely love doing short stories. There's something about just a tight, self-contained, punchy little short story that's really satisfying. And I really don't even feel like I've done a proper novel. Like I said, I refer to House and Black River as novellas because they're like an extended short story, or it's a novella. It's just like it's not as there's not as many characters or themes or changes going on within the story that I would like. I've had ideas for really like a big 400-page or 500-page thing for years that I would love to do, but it's mostly just a matter of the logistics of doing comics and how difficult it is to make money and to keep working on them, that I don't know, it's just really hard to sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to sit down and do like the 500-page thing. So to some degree, it has to be just short things that I know I can accomplish. And even the short books, like House was 80 pages and Black River was like 110 pages. So it just seems manageable, But I've been thinking recently that I really do need to sit down and write the big long one that I've been wanting to do for a while, and just start working on it, even if it takes 10 years to draw it or whatever. Yeah, I'd like to do that.
And this gets back to an earlier discussion topic we brought up, and that is, differences in terms of shorter comics, longer comics, and the difference in tone. Because I'm thinking of some of your shorter comics like In the Land of Magic and Cockbone and the Furry Trap. And those are, really graphic. And you're able, especially something like In the Land of Magic and Cockbone, where you just let it all go. And it's fun. It's offensive, but it's fun. It reminds me of what Gilbert Hernandez is doing now with his Blubber series, right? It's not as if we've never seen Gilbert Hernandez, get explicit when it comes to the sex and violence. It's just that in Blubber, it's cranked up to 11. And so those shorter works, you really do that. But I guess you can't do that in longer narratives, because once you get that burst of either violence or sex, what are you going to do with that for the rest of the story? And you can weave it into the narrative in some way, but it seems that a longer form of storytelling would almost necessitate this more muted dealing with I don't know, with characters, relationships, sex and violence, all that.
Right. Yeah, there's really not even that much violence maybe in Black River as an example, but I guess sometimes people's reactions to it are that it's just unbelievably violent and grotesque. But I don't know. This is I guess is something I figured out with my stuff a while back. Maybe the Batman story was the first place I did this, where it's not even, there's only one page of violence in this, what is that, 16 or 18 page story?
Yeah, this is Mark of the Bat.
Yeah, Mark of the Bat from Furry Trap. Yeah, it's not a Batman comic. It's a Bat hero. So I think that's the first one where I was like, okay, I'm really going to take time and yeah, there's going to be this kind of, we're just going to see this guy hanging out in the city and swinging around, and you kind of get his interaction with this cat lady character and figure out a little bit about him and kind of see what he's about before you see him doing something horrible. And I think something about that makes the violence that much more effective and impactful, as opposed to, I've done stuff that is more aggressive, or the best example in comics might be Johnny Ryan or maybe Benjamin Mara to some degree. Where like Amwat's an example of a book you're talking about where it just starts off insane and over the top and just keeps topping itself. And I think it works for that book, maybe more because it's more humor oriented. But I don't know. I think my stuff is more like, maybe it seems kind of fun or comedic at first, but ultimately it kind of ends in tragedy or despair. Because they're I guess they're tragedies more. They're not really ultimately comedies, even if there are funny elements to them.
Yeah, you mentioned Black River, and there are some disturbing moments in Black River, but the thing about and what's the leader's name? Sika.
Yeah, Sika.
Her and her crew. When they're captured about halfway through the story, a lot of the violence, a lot of the rape that we see. This takes place off panel. We never see it. We know it's taking place, and there is a lot of violence in Black River, but it again. The amount of violence that we never see, I think in many ways makes what we do see much more effective.
Yeah, and that's something I've been playing with for a long time. There's this, I don't know where this quote came from, but when people talk about horror movies, there's this idea that what the viewer can imagine is always scarier than what the best special effects artist can show you, which I don't think is true, but to some degree, I mean, that works with horror fiction, like when you're reading something. So I'm always kind of like trying to figure out the balance between the two, I guess. And with Furry Trap, you see it where there's a progression, there's a structure to the way those stories are put together in the book, where it starts with the most over-the-top, graphic, horrendous thing that I can show you, which goes on and on and on. And then as the book goes on, it becomes a little more sophisticated, slightly more restrained, hopefully, until you get to that last story, which doesn't show anything. But I think there's something about like your imagination is so like goosed up or juiced up from all the stuff that you've seen that carries over into a story where you're just imagining things.
Mm-hmm. Well, even the way that, let's say, Cockbone ends, I mean, it starts off very explicit, but then by the time we get to the end, it's, again, off panel, right? I mean, there's no neat wrap up. There's no resolution. We don't know exactly what happens to him at the end, but that makes it an effective ending. Then, if we would have seen the kind of things that we see at the beginning of the story.
Yeah, and I feel like that story was a little bit of a breakthrough for me. I know that people like that last page a lot. It seems to work. And I don't know where that came from, because it's kind of a weird way of ending a story. But yeah, I'm definitely with that story. It's like, yeah, you have all this, you leave it to the reader's imagination ultimately at the end to some degree. And with Black River, the confrontation with the gang of men is about, I think it's exactly like halfway through the book. It starts and it goes for 20 or so pages. And then you still have 30 or so pages left where it's kind of just the effects of that, like part of what I'm doing, I guess, is like thinking about violence and sometimes the way it's portrayed, or thinking about real violence. And a lot of the time that kind of stuff, like the effects of violence, gets skimmed over, and I want people to kind of feel the, maybe it's like PTSD or, just how violence might affect somebody. So ultimately you're sitting with it, and it's not fun. It's not exciting. It's just sad and rough,
Yeah. And, again, back to Black River, the way that it ends, and I don't want to give anything away. I mean, I think it's the character Susie, who, is the one who cuts her hair, scars her face, and then wanders off. And then what we see at the very end of Black River is all about what you mentioned, right? The after effects of all of that violence.
Right. Because, right. I mean, so if we're talking about how violence is portrayed in movies and comics and stuff, generally it's shown to be kind of like a lark. It's a joke, it's fun. It's mayhem for mayhem's sake, and that stuff's fine. Like sometimes I enjoy that stuff, but I guess I wanted to bring an element of where like you actually feel it again, and it's upsetting again. And so the end of Black River is like the last 30 pages is like I think it's quiet. It's very like I wanted the story to kind of feel like it was just meandering off, and just kind of like drifting off into the fog or something. Mm-hmm. Whereas with my short stories, I guess they tend to end with a punch, It's just like the last kind of kick to the stomach.
Well, with both the...
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, definitely. With the violence, with the explicitness, but also your storytelling style as a whole. You've mentioned a few of the comics creators that seem to have had some kind of effect on you. Daniel Klaus, Chester Brown, Johnny Ryan. What about storytellers in other media, visual and otherwise?
Oh, golly. Let's see. Well, I guess a big one is Zulawski, who died this year. He just died a couple months ago. It was a Polish director, Andrzej Zulawski, I think. I don't know if I got the pronunciation exactly. But his most famous movie is called Possession. Have you seen that?
No, but I've heard of it. I haven't seen that one.
It's from 1980. It's got Isabella Gianni and Sam Neill. And, I remember seeing it as a teenager and not really understanding it at all because I was into... Well, maybe even as a kid, I saw it when I was into just things like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. And those things are easy to kind of get your head around and understand. It's just like a maniac stabbing, teenagers to death. And there's a kind of like pop fun element to that. But Possession is really it's very, very surreal and abstract and cerebral take on a horror movie, and it's ultimately kind of just I think a relationship drama more than anything, and it's about a relationship falling apart, and I think that's pretty universal. So when I saw it as an adult and after I experienced things like that, it really kind of hit me in the gut, and I love that kind of way of telling a story where you're using certain genre elements. And some of it is really hard to get your head around, but you can just feel it, So he was a big one. Come and See is a movie that I love. Have you seen that one?
No. Mm-mm.
It's a Russian movie about a Russian movie from the 80s, which is about a young boy in Russia during World War II when as the Nazis invade, and it's a really, really, really horrific movie, but also like very impressionistic and lyrical and beautiful. Golly, what else? I saw the new Salons movie a couple nights ago, and I know he was a big influence for me. Todd Solondz. Have you seen any of his movies?
I'm embarrassingly lax on movie watching over the past several years, and I've said this before. I think that this is a function of having kids, but I can't say that much anymore because they're almost grown.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, have you seen Happiness? That's kind of one of his more well-known movies from the 90s.
No, yeah, this has turned into, hey, what movies have you seen, Derek, kind of conversation.
Gotcha.
No, I haven't seen that one either.
Let me ask, do you see any sort of correlation between any sort of work that you've enjoyed with my stuff from any, sort of media?
Well, with me, it's, I guess, the type of stories that you tell. I've mentioned dreamlike a few times, and I think that strikes me as a good way for me of wrapping my brain around and appreciating many of the things that you've done. Also, there's an absurdist quality to many of these stories, and that has very much a European flavor to it. Not as if we don't have absurdist narrative, outside of Europe, but still, I tend to think, both in terms of prose and also in terms of film, that kind of storytelling I seem to see more of. So it does strike me as very different from I would say most U.S. comics makers, and I'm not even talking about the mainstream, right? I mean, to compare Jessica Farm, Black River, the stuff in Furry Trap, to what we see coming out of DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, different planets right there. But if you take within the context, let's say, independent creation, small press stuff, however you choose to call them, alternative comics, some people, like to call them, then, I think there's something even less mainstream-ish to your comics than, most of, let's say, the alternative creators. Okay, a good example, I don't know why he popped into my head, is Peter Bagg. I love Peter Bagg's work. I love his stories. I love the hate stuff. But his way of telling a story is, as offbeat as it can be, still is fairly conventional.
Yeah.
Very, very different. Same thing with the Hernandez brothers, right? But very, very different from the kind of comics that you do. And I would say even with someone like a Daniel Klaus, right? In many ways, his storytelling, for instance, the most recent book, Patience, I think is quite conventional in what it does. I don't think that it's anything that takes, I think, the kind of chances that I expected it to, and maybe that's because of all the hype that went on with the book around the time that it came out. But I thought that was fairly conventional. And I mentioned Klaus and Patience because you mentioned him, or at least his earlier work, as something that you felt that resonated with you.
Man, yeah, I really appreciate that, because I feel like I think especially the absurdist, the idea of like it being absurdist storytelling, like that's kind of the word that I've been coming to think of recently is like, well, yeah, that kind of nails it, because my stuff tends to get really strong reactions. Like it is like love it or hate it kind of work. And I think a lot of the time when it's somebody who just hates my stuff, it's because of like the sort of part of it is like the fan culture in this country, maybe particularly, maybe it's an American sensibility particularly, but people don't seem to, part of it is like, it is incredibly violent and over the top, but it's also this kind of absurdist or abstract approach to storytelling. And I think those two things combined just completely drive some people nuts and they just loathe it. Maybe like a better comparison even for my stuff would be not even like, say, 70s horror directors like Romero or Carpenter, but it's even closer to like Monty Python. And if people don't get or understand Monty Python, they're not going to get my stuff. It's like a mix of like Monty Python and John Carpenter. Maybe that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Or I was thinking of this, since we're talking about an absurdist mindset, then what if you combine Monty Python with the films of Ingmar Bergman? Because there is, sure. Because for some reason I think of something Scandinavian when I read some of your stories, and so if you could combine those two, and that may not make sense, right? Monty Python and Ingmar Bergman, but there is something Bergman-esque, I guess, about your storytelling. But if you inject it with some of this over the top, the over the topness that goes in with the sex and the violence, then that's the Monty Python. And, the kind of craziness at times as well. Right.
Or, like Fulci, or Dario Argento, like there's two European directors from the 70s who did this completely over the top, like dreamlike narratives. And, just a lot of people aren't going to respond to that. They do not get it. They do not appreciate it. I've met people in my life who are like, I hate Monty Python. I don't understand how anyone could be into something like that. And we're really getting to the bottom of it, Derek. This is good. This is good work. Good therapy right here.
Yeah, well, good. And I don't charge by the hour either.
And Bergman's also somebody I've definitely spent a lot of time with. And I remember the first movie of his I saw was Hour of the Wolf when I think it was a teenager, and that one kind of blew me away because there's a lot of, with his stuff, there's a lot of the mundane, a lot of prosaic things that he's dealing with, but then there's these kind of touches of surrealism or fantasy or dark, nightmarish elements, which to me that just adds up. That's the kind of thing that I really enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking of Wild Strawberries.
Okay, I just saw that one recently.
Because there you have the mundane, but also it's very dreamlike in places. It's been a long time since I've seen it.
Right. Yeah. For some reason, that one didn't stick with me as much. But yeah, he's a guy. He's a good guy.
Well, you're talking about the reaction of, this kind of storytelling, and maybe as it applies to your comics. What kind of reader reaction have you received when you've been at various conventions, when people contact you, maybe emailing you and getting in touch with you about, their reaction to, let's say, Jessica Farm or Black River?
The most extreme reaction I got was from the Furry Trap. When I went on tour last year, I sold it to somebody, and they emailed me this letter, which, it was so over the top. Like, you read something like that and you're kind of worried about the person. And you kind of realize with art, like, people are bringing their own shit to it, And I think there's enough... another thing with art that I like is that there needs to be a certain amount of space for a reader to fill in the blanks or to bring their own baggage to it. Mm-hmm. And I try to do that with my stuff. And sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I think maybe people don't like what the work is showing them or what it's telling them about themselves. That might sound a little egotistical, but definitely with this guy, like, and some people, he was very, very upset, and he let me know about it in no uncertain terms. And he wanted to send me the book back and get his money back. And, I was just like, it was so over the top that I just never responded to the guy, because it's like, that's all your own shit. And you're just projecting it onto me for this book, which isn't saying, it is, I know it's an upsetting book. I know there's a lot of gnarly subject matter in it, but ultimately, I'm not responsible for someone else's reaction or someone else's state of mind. But I guess in a way it's flattering if it can be that, effective and that affecting to somebody.
What about the reaction to the recent Jessica Farm stuff?
There hasn't been much. I don't know. The Jessica Farm stuff tends to be when the first volume came out, it didn't do as well as House. I'm not exactly sure why. I think in part because it's just kind of a weird project. Maybe it's just not as good as some of my other stuff. I don't know. I don't hear a lot of stuff about it.
Do you read reviews of your stuff?
Yeah, I try not to spend too much time with it because, I will fret. And, I'm a fairly neurotic, anxious person in the world and in reality and in my life. The comics and the art have always been the place where I can be like completely unfettered and kind of fearless. But like when I'm making these stories, I do worry about how the people are going to react. I don't want to upset people. I'm not like a combative person, but it's just the way the stories have to be. Speaking of Johnny Ryan, he said that he likes getting negative reactions to his stuff. Like he likes when people are upset or shocked by his work. Mm-hmm. And that's great. That's hilarious and that suits him. But I'm definitely not like that in my life. But
so you don't feed off of that.
I don't enjoy it, but I do definitely get those reactions.
Yeah. It's funny, again, about Johnny Ryan. I was really surprised in many ways that collection of Angry Youth comics, and I like that collection, but I was surprised
the big one?
Yeah, that came out last year. I was really surprised that it was nominated for an Eisner under the humor category.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. It's
or
definitely...
maybe it was. I can't remember. Was it humor or was it best archival? I can't recall. It's one of those two. I'm forgetting now.
Right. I don't know. Yeah, those both would make sense to me. I thought it was I didn't read it because I'd read most of the work in it already. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was a beautiful book. And, I mean, it's definitely humorous work. So why were you surprised by that?
I don't know. I thought that the nature of the strips would be so much that it wouldn't get nominated. And, I've said this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. I think one thing that surprised me, and it may have been under the archive, and I should remember this, but I don't. It could have been under the archival category of the collection. One of the things that surprised me was that Klaus's 8-Ball collection wasn't nominated for anything, and then Angry Youth Comics was.
So that is weird.
Yeah, that struck me as a little unusual. And then, given the fact that the past couple of years, including this year, there has been much more, I guess, inclusiveness and diversity when it comes to who gets nominations with the Eisners, I would have thought that would have worked against Johnny Ryan's favor with this Angry Youth Comics collection. But, hey, I mean, apparently there were enough of those 6 judges that decided, why not?
Yeah, I mean, God, who knows? I mean, those awards things, I barely follow them because they're so absurd. They're so ridiculous most of the time. I mean, I'm glad Johnny got nominated for that. To my mind, I mean, definitely that 8-Ball collection should have been. That's the best archival book of that year. So that just kind of illustrates the absurdity of it all.
Yeah.
I was nominated for an Eisner for a story from Habit Number 1, which was like a 300 print run mini comic, competing against a lot of stuff from the big 2, or at least Fantagraphics and Image. And I mean, I thought that was great, but it's also kind of absurd. And I lost to Gilbert Hernandez, by the way, which I'm completely happy to lose to.
Oh, yeah. If you're going to lose to someone, why not, one of the best?
Yeah, he's my comics daddy.
Yeah. By the way, I did look it up, and Angry Youth Comics is nominated for the Best Graphic Album Reprint category.
Sorry, which one? 8-Ball or Angry Youth?
Angry Youth Comics. Yeah, 8-Ball's nowhere on the list.
Okay, yeah. Ugh, weird. Yeah, who knows? Who knows?
Figure. Yeah. So, you've mentioned that in addition to your ongoing work with Jessica Farm, where you're producing a page a month, that you have several other things going on at the same time. So, I mean, what are you currently working on now, both the shorter and maybe even longer work? Something like a Black River or a House.
I'm between long books, Black River and the tour that I went on, and then immediately having to finish up Habit 2 last year was like a brutal work stretch. So I took a couple months off drawing this past winter, and I've been I've been a little burnt out and just having to take it a little easier. So for a long time, I said no to a lot of invitations to be in anthologies and stuff. And this year I'm kind of doing short stuff for anthologies mostly. So what did I do? Well, right now I'm penciling a strip for the Seattle free comics paper called Intruder, which I've done 4 or 5 things for in the past. And it's a really challenging strip. It's like one big page of a tabloid newspaper. It's going to be about 40 panels, so really small panels. And it's for the final issue of Intruder. And it's like a fake autobio strip that takes place at a party. And I'm trying to draw basically everyone I ever knew fairly well in Seattle into this comic. So it's kind of challenging in that way. I just did a couple things for a Shirley Jackson anthology, which Rob Kirby's putting together, and a short story for a kind of horror and porn anthology called Mirror Mirror 2, which Shanti Collins and Julia Julia G are putting together. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of short stuff. And what's coming up? Oh, and I'm quitting my day job in about a month. and I'm going to take a stab at the freelance life. And I have 2 big art paying gigs that I'm going to start on in July. One is a commission painting, a large commission painting, and the other is writing on a new line of comics, which hasn't come out yet. But so I can't really say. I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it, and I like secrets anyway.
Okay.
But so those are the 2 big things I'm going to be working on this summer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, is this writing gig with a publisher that we would recognize?
Yeah, I don't know if that's nailed down yet, though.
Okay. We'll just leave it at that then.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Josh, I want to thank you for taking the time and talking with me for the Comics Alternative. It's been a lot of fun talking about not only Jessica Farm, but all your other work as well.
Oh, thank you, Derek. Yeah, it was great to be on here. Great to talk to you.
Well, that was great. I want to thank Josh again for being on the Comics Alternative. Had a wonderful time talking with him about his comics, Doctor Who, and foreign films. It was a really lively discussion. And if you want to find out more about the work of Josh Simmons, well, you can find his books by going to the website of our sponsor, and that's Discount Comic Book Service. In fact, if you go there right now, you'll find that you can get both of those new volumes of Jessica Farm at 35% off cover price. You can also find his book from last year, Black River, and the collection, The Furry Trap, at 30% off of the cover price. So that's dcbservice.com. It's a great place to get your comics. And after you do get your Josh Simmons fix there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my interview. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, which is a very simple and easy-to-use program. Or if you want to be a little more difficult about it, pick up the phone and call us at 415-3COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email the show. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us on various places in the social media sphere, including Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. You can listen to us on Spotify. And if you're an Android user, you can find us on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We have more interviews in the weeks to come, so listen up for those. Until then, I'm Derek. Take care.